Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 14th of June. Today we're looking at important developments from the front line south of Kostyantynivka. We'll also look at an important movement west of Marinka. There are some developments that are going on within the Vovcha riverfront. And we'll also look at the Siversk Salient and finish off by looking further north at the Kharkiv border around the Lyptsi Axis specifically. Let's begin by examining what occurred south of, I guess you could say, either Kostyantynivka or Novomikhailivka. What's going on is, as I've said in previous videos, the Russian forces are trying to secure these fields and various trenches and tree lines located south of the village of Kostyantynivka, simply in order to get, first of all, control of the hills overlooking said village, but also to, of course, get control of that southern flank that connects this village to Vovcha. And so we're just seeing that process manifest itself in a very gradual manner, as you do have a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements that were sent in specifically from this assault battalion Scala. And so they've played a role in conducting localized counterattacks and just dragging out the fighting for as long as possible. And as a result, it seems that some of these villages here that are just directly southwest of Novomikhailivka, they still remain a gray zone due to this protracted resistance and the back and forth, as you do have, in some cases, Russian vehicles advancing several hundred meters and then being repelled, and this happens on a daily basis. And so it is hard to get an exact idea of which tree line they do permanently hold on to, but we do know that they do have a presence rather close to Kostyantynivka based on footage from, it's now 10 days ago, of compilation footage from the Ukrainian side, their 79th Air Assault Brigade, targeting such Russian columns. But further south, there does appear to be a larger gray zone, as you can see with this open area, this open salient on the map. Here we do have confirmation, though, of a Russian advance. It was recorded by the Shadow Drone Group, which is operating in conjunction with the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. Here they destroyed a Russian MTLB, and as it was catching on fire, essentially, because it, of course, did have a lot of armored protection on top, the Russian infantry that were located within it, they dismounted and were able to get out without any sort of casualties, and they succeeded in occupying the trenches nonetheless. And then by the end, we saw that the Ukrainians were targeting these Russian forces that had dismounted and taken over these new positions, utilizing the cluster munition shells that they had, and that essentially gave us verification of a minor Russian advance in this direction. If we look at its extent, it amounts to something of 600, 700 meters westwards. And then for the time being, there aren't any updates on the other situations surrounding these fields. What we do know, though, is that there's been a recent activation further north in the region west of Marinka. This is a very important region, and this was really basically the Russian forces were able to take advantage of the underlying geography in the region following their capture of Pobieda. Pobieda was very important to the Ukrainians once Marinka fell, because it served as their forward operating base, because you had houses there and basements, warehouses, so you could have mechanized forces operate there, and then from there be sent to the front line to engage with Russian forces in nearby fields. So the fall of Pobieda, not only is it significant because, again, it's located on this Druzhby Avenue, this road that then leads further south to Kostyantynivka, so the Russians do have control of this northern flank of this chain of Ukrainian-controlled villages. Also, Pobieda is located on a hill, along with a lot of the other fields west of Pobieda. Essentially, all this region over here is south of Marinka is on a hill. And just to further expand on that, there's just a massive ridge located in the southwestern part of Donetsk city. If we look at the area around Petrovsky district, and then even further south along this rail line, which I'll mark in red for you guys, all this region is on a very high ridge, which essentially overlooks the rest of the battlefield where there are conflicts right now between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, there are still hills in the frontline region, but to a much lesser extent than what we see a couple, or maybe it's like 15 kilometers eastwards within the city of Donetsk. And so the Russians generally do have that elevation advantage, and then even on a localized level with the capture of Pobieda, they do have that advantage, and that helps them, of course, overlook some of the Ukrainian forward defensive positions that you see marked in yellow over here that are just west of the highway, that are currently being manned by elements such as the 31st Mechanized Brigade, moved from Zaporozhye 33rd Mechanized Brigade also moved from the counteroffensive sectors from last year. And you do have elements of air assault units like 79th, 46th, and the list goes on. And so it's not necessarily an empty area. There really shouldn't be gaps here due to the mechanized units that are located in this region, but it is hard for them to organize a large force and maintain defensive positions because there simply aren't any populated areas in this basically large swath of fields, 10 kilometers spanning between Heorhiivka and Kostyantynivka, which are the two Ukrainian chains of villages in this general southern Donetsk sector. And there are two parallel chains of villages that you can see extend to the northwest. And you see the Russian forces advancing directly through them, but also getting control of hills in between them. And that's a big issue for the Ukrainians and why they're trying to hold on to whatever tree lines or trenches that they do have in between. What we do see, though, is that the Russian forces, they were able to, after months of heavy fighting within Heorhiivka, secure most of central Heorhiivka and western Heorhiivka without much of a heavy battle. We saw most of the heavy fighting occurring in the eastern part of the village, especially after the capture of Marinka. You had Russian and DPR forces involved with the clearing out of the Ukrainian pockets of resistance here, which of course you had the Ukrainian airborne units that were holding here, and the Russians that cleared out the nearby residential areas, the local church, whatever it may be, all of these regions around the ponds. And this was essentially verified by mid-May that the Russians had the front line looking something like this, where they had already bypassed the final pond in the region. And now we have this geolocated footage that was released by the 46th Air Assault Brigade, which is really important because it shows a rather large advance that confirms the full capture of the village of Heorhiivka, but also that the Russians were able to infiltrate into this other village, Heorhiivka, I think that's how you say it. And so this was recorded on June 13th, and it shows how the 46th Brigade was able to target this very large Russian column, the largest Russian vehicle coordinated attack that the 46th Brigade had to deal with since being deployed to this part of the front line. They claimed that 28 vehicles were involved, and so that, just think about that. In a single engagement, that is a very large amount, something that we don't see usually, even though there are many large vehicular assaults in this region. Usually they're half that size or even less. And so that definitely played a role in saturating the Ukrainian defense and allowing some of them to bypass Ukrainian firepower and dismount within these various villages that are further westwards. The main vectors of advance include the main road through Heorhiivka, but also fields that are either to the north or south of the village, which again shows how the Russians were utilizing the flank, and at least on the southern flank, they were able to undermine some of the Ukrainian defensive positions that are imagined to still be in existence within these yellow lines, and some of them that are still under Ukrainian control are now in a more compromised position, and I guess you could say very close to the front line. If you're looking at the Ukrainian claims, they say that they were able to destroy 13 units of Russian vehicles, kill 20 Russian soldiers, and wound 38. In the actual footage, which is rather long, they do show evidence for many of these vehicular losses, not all of them. They show 7 at the beginning, 7 FPV strikes on various vehicles, including BMPs, MTLBs, tanks, whatever assortment that you could imagine. There were also various artillery strikes, since you did have Ukrainian artillery components, and this makes sense because you do have some Ukrainian artillery batteries located in the general region around Kurakove, especially in these hills just to the north of the Vovcha River and the rather large pond that you see in that same region. And so, yeah, there was artillery strikes on various houses within Heorhiivka, which verified the Russian presence over there. You also had additional artillery strikes on 2 Russian vehicles that were advancing along an open field. There appears that there were direct hits on those 2 vehicles. But we didn't see the aftermath for the extent of the destruction. There was also a clip of ATGM firing towards a Russian vehicle, and then you see at the end 4 Russian vehicles that are abandoned. One of them has a sign of significant damage, and the other ones are just abandoned. And this is along an open field, but there's a path in the region. It may be in the area north of Heorhiivka or south, as I said before. And you had just other FPV strikes on houses and dugouts. And so, yeah, there was a lot of coordination for the Ukrainian defensive aspect of it. where they were able to gather the reconnaissance drones that were able to spot a large amount of those vehicles and then fix artillery onto them. And so definitely a certain portion were destroyed, but you can't really tell from the FPV clips without seeing the aftermath footage. And so seeing those 4 vehicles, for instance, abandoned and destroyed, that's conclusive evidence. But then seeing strikes in or around vehicles, this still leaves an area for ambiguity. But definitely, yeah, when you have that amount of vehicles, it does open the pathway for a lot of them, in some cases the majority, to be destroyed. The point is that the furthest west geolocation was within Heorhiivka, which is a village that is rather deep into the Ukrainian line in this region. Is something that we really hadn't expected, because if we measure the extent of the advance, it is something amounting to 2 kilometers, 2.4 kilometers westwards. And of course, you can't really say with certainty that the Russians have a solid control in this eastern outskirts, so I'm leaving it as a gray zone. But it does show, for instance, that within Heorhiivka, it's essentially under their full control. This was verified again in the same clip where they destroyed, or they sent an FPV to hit a Russian-controlled warehouse, and you could see a Russian vehicle destroyed nearby. And so again, they're now turning this into an organizing point of the Russians, and that will help them out with further assaults into Heorhiivka. And that village, if we look at it from its furthest west point, is only around 4 kilometers away from Kharkov, which is the massive Russian objective in the region that have been ringing alarm bells about for over a year now. Just all the roads lead to Kharkov and branch out from it. You could see how the Ukrainians even prepared multiple layers of defense on its perimeter, and of course utilizing the Vovcha River as a massive geographic advantage if they end up losing Kharkov. There's also, as I said before, a massive hill north of it. And so there is a lot of significance, and cutting it off, even when you look south, in terms of supplying an area like Vovcha for the Ukrainians and Kostyantynivka. And so definitely this does play a role in furthering Russia's efforts. If we look at elevation, there are, I guess you could say, minor hills located west of Pobieda that could be taken over. That would help in overlooking Kharkov, simply because it is on very low elevation. And so keep an eye out for whatever Russian activity goes on over there. And then in terms of elevation along Heorhiivka, it's basically on the same elevation as Kharkov. But of course, you do have the advantage of utilizing paved roads to enter and attack from the east. Now looking at the Pokrovsk direction, we do have confirmation of Russians pushing directly east of Novoselyivka-Persha, which was really bound to happen following the fall of Novopokrovsk, as it shows that the Russian forces are able to directly infiltrate into these villages on valleys and just push through, whether it be through infantry that dismounted or through vehicles that paved the way. And now we have confirmation of a further advance based on video released by the 68th Jaeger Brigade, which I talked about in my last video, and now we know that it's still operating here after a long time that we didn't hear from them. And so we have the video. This is an earlier video from June 13th, which shows the furthest extent of the Russian advances through these fields southeast of Novoselyivka. And now we know that the Russian forces took advantage of essentially clearing out the gray zone east of this village and clearing out Novopokrovsk to then move in infantry, a lot of them coming in potentially from the northeast, from the Solovyov direction, and then a lot of vehicles coming in along this paved road, and then being able to make strides towards the village itself. This was again filmed on camera by 68th Brigade, and so it's a compilation from June 14th of shelling, dropping grenades onto the Russian column. They claim that they were able to destroy 8 Russian tanks and 8 Russian BMPs using the coordinated efforts of their scouts, gunners, UAVs, and sappers. And we could see in the video, because I'll just walk you through it, because this was the general vector of advance adjacent to a nearby tree line they were able to attack. And the first Russian vehicle within the column, it was hit by artillery, including cluster munitions. And so the first vehicle was likely hit. And then afterwards, that's when you had the barrage of cluster munitions that was fired towards that same concentration of Russian forces. Then you also see, and I don't know the exact geolocation, and it's probably nearby, but there was a Russian tank that fell into a crater. And at that point, you had drones dropping grenades onto it, causing its eventual destruction. And then at the end, there's just footage from this general region showing 3 Russian vehicles that were abandoned, but you just can't see any sort of evidence of destruction. But nonetheless, they were definitely just left there. And that gives an idea of the fact that the initial probes by the Russians into the village were able to be pushed back, but it means that now the front line has been moved so much westwards that there isn't any room for the Ukrainians to set up defenses, only within the village itself. And so it's really only a matter of time before the Russians are able to enter it, and they'd have so many vectors through which to do so that it's really become difficult for any sort of defensive unit to hold on here for any long period of time. And that also spells the end for any other Ukrainian resistance in Sokiel, Voskod, or any other villages that are east of the Vovcha River, because the fall of Novoselivka Parashel would just give the Russians this very easy access to this paved road that would just run through directly past the Ukrainian forward defensive lines in the region if they don't fall by that time. Because we are also seeing that the Russians are making gains within the eastern outskirts of Sokiel. We still don't have footage of Russians actually taking over houses in Sokiel, bar that video that we talked about from June 7th of the Russian BTR that was able to infiltrate the Sokiel despite the attempts to destroy it by the Bradley. And here we have just some of the recent geolocated videos from this region that confirm Russian advances, a lot of them going on foot. Here's a video from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, June 13th. Their strikes drone company. It hit a Russian soldier east of Sokiel. Here, what is this? Let's see if this is related. This one is actually. And so this is just a video, another compilation video from the 47th Brigade showing 5 Russian BMPs and MTLBs getting hit either by mines or FPVs. I think this specific geolocation talks about a Russian BMP that was hit by a mine. And so again, you can see how these vehicles are paving the way for eventual Russian dismounts and then conquering of Sokiel. And so then again, that also puts enormous pressure on the nearby trenches north of Sokiel that have played a big role in trying to hold the line. Now, looking at the Siversk Salient, I really don't talk about this part of the front enough, but that's in part because it has been lower on the pecking order for both sides for over a year and a half. Nonetheless, there are some important developments here. The Russian forces may not have a massive concentration of forces, and many of the forces they do have may be from the LPR or DPR, but despite that fact, they are able to conduct advances from the southern flank of Siversk, and recently those advances have increased in their scale and in their actual gains that they yielded. The Ukrainians are mainly defending utilizing 3 brigades in this salient, including the 81st Air Assault Brigade around Heorhiivka, and then further south you have 10th Mountain Assault Brigade and 54th Mechanized Brigade that you see marked in this region. And so they're just playing a role in prolonging the resistance. But you go further south, you look at Rozhdolivka, the Russian forces, they were confirmed based on a video from June 13th that they were able to reach the eastern entrance into the village. And in the same clip, you have a video from the same region where you had a Russian armored fighting vehicle hit and destroyed in a field. And so again, you had some vehicles and some infantry that were advancing along this axis. The extent of the advance, if we look at it, amounts to about 1.7 kilometers northwards. So it is significant in that regard. It also means that Rozhdolivka is sort of pushed into a corner because any troops that remain here, they are of course being flanked from the east. And then from the west, you have the Bakhmutovka River. To the north, you have the Sukha Plotva River. And so it's going to be difficult for whatever squads remain here to make it out in a cohesive way. And you can see how the Russians are succeeding in squeezing them out gradually. And so the Ukrainians have already made plans to try to resist without Rozhdolivka, try to maintain a front line that is more solid and is more horizontal in nature. You can see how that's trying to be constructed, at least by the Ukrainians, utilizing these trenches and dugouts that you see marked with the yellow and now red lines that essentially go through Perizhnya and Fedorivka, and trying to utilize the Bakhmutovka River and other nearby tributaries to their advantage. And so the idea for the Ukrainians would be to utilize the hills on which these defenses are located to just try to maintain the front line and prevent the Russians from exploiting this southern flank of Siversk to continue advancing along the same attack routes that would be essentially parallel to the Bakhmutovka River, parallel to the tree lines and rail lines over here, that could then pose a very serious threat to Siversk's southern flank, which is less protected than its eastern flank, because for a long time there was a worry for the Ukrainian side that they would face attacks, especially 2022, but then even later on, coming from the eastern direction from Lyptsi and several Donetsk. And due to the Ukrainians holding the line over there, the Russians changed strategy, changed course, and are now trying to bypass those defenses by attacking from the south, where you do have less Ukrainian preparations. And you can see that really manifests itself in how these lines are built over here, where I'm basically going over in red. And if we look at the rest of the front line here, it really does connect to Vesele and to Vimka. The Russian forces, first of all, they control hills that are located west of Yakovlivka, and so it gives them a direct line of sight to overlook Rozdolivka and nearby Ukrainian positions on valleys. The Ukrainians, they do in part control hills that are located to the southwest of Vimka, but that's a part of why the Russians conducted their attacks in that region in the first place. First, we had this video from June 9th showing Russian infantry dismount off of 2 motorcycles. We see a lot of that in this part of the front line. And they entered trenches on the railway embankment under Ukrainian cluster munition shelling, but it was not enough. The front line changed. The Russian forces were able to secure these additional hills, which do play a part in undermining the new theoretical Ukrainian defense line a couple of kilometers north of Rozdolivka. And then further north along the same railway embankment, you do have Russian momentum. On June 12th, they had a video released by Ukrainian side of their drones dropping grenades onto Russian positions in these trenches near the railway. And again, all these regions that we're referring to, northwest of Berestova, for instance, which is over here, they're also all on hills. All this region is just very rugged in terrain, a lot of ridges in the region. But then Vimka itself, where the Ukrainians are defending and where they have some trenches that were dug up, that area is on very low elevation, and you can see the same thing about an area like Ivanodarivka or Spirnya. And so all those villages are now rather close to the front line, and they're being attacked from the vertical axis, not from the eastern attack vector that was potentially thought of when defenses were being built at the time. And so that puts into worry, I guess you could say, some of these other strongholds that the Ukrainians set up in the region and how well they would be able to stand up against Russian assaults. And if we zoom out for a moment, you can generally see how the Russian forces are thinking with their attack vectors, generally leading to that southern flank of Siversk. And lastly, we're looking at the Lyptsi Axis. Here we have a video released on June 13th by the 13th Khartia National Guard Brigade, Ukrainian force that were sent in to contain the Russian attack on this axis and then, of course, conduct localized counterattacks as we've seen this month. And this is the one area I would say where, besides, of course, Vovcha, where the 82nd Brigade counterattacked and advanced a couple hundred meters, this area has also seen some advances when we look at the extent, because, first of all, they were able to prevent the Russians from entering into Lyptsi, and then from there they were able to retake the hills that overlook the village from the northeast, and so that was very critical in preventing a broader collapse. Just for the time being, it's very important, and then utilizing that same paved road to advance to the northeast, and now their current objective is dislodging the Russians from Hliboke, and so we're going to see fierce fighting on the Russian side on their behalf to at least try to maintain the front line and prevent the fall of Hliboke, because simply it is a very good forward node to then conduct further assaults in the future if we're looking towards an area like Lyptsi. And so just looking at the sort of activities the Ukrainians conducted over here, we have this geolocated video which shows some of the operations conducting vehicles. They're not using them in a massive scale if we're comparing it to Russian assaults, for instance, around Marinka, but they are using some vehicles as well. I would say you could count them on a single hand sometimes. And so just in one case, you had these 2 Ukrainian armored personnel carriers. I think they're called Antiela APCs, Polish donated, and so they were advancing along this particular road. They were able to reach a certain intersection and then just fire towards Russian positions in these various trenches over here, trying to take them over. In the geolocation, it confirmed the Ukrainian advance through the region. You also had a Ukrainian M113 with a cope cage that was able to advance through the fields that are located directly south of Hliboke along this certain marker. And this was done under Ukrainian or Russian, FPV fire, and was able to survive those engagements. It was able to conduct various rotations and medical evacuations at the same time, and then entered at the end into the southern part of Hliboke without being fired upon at the moment in which it entered. And I think it entered through this particular area, and so these fields to the south have been secured and are now being utilized by Ukrainian vehicles to try to enter in and try to overrun the village itself, which has still not happened. And you just have other incidents that were recorded by the Ukrainians. For instance, they used a BMP-1, the variation that's called the Promintex, and it just fired towards various Russian positions located in the western parts of Heorhiivka as well. For now, the Russians do maintain most of the control over Heorhiivka, and it is important to note that there's a massive manpower disparity here when we're looking at the numbers. I'm just doing this off the top of my head just by looking at the units that are involved, and that's not completely scientific, but it is just something that I'm doing off the cuff. Around 6,000, 7,000 Russian forces located in this general axis, and you have the Ukrainian side not with that much more here. It perhaps, if we're looking at some of the units involved, then it could amount to 12,000 or perhaps a little bit more than that. And so in this Lyptsi Axis, the manpower disparity isn't as large as in Vovcha, where you do have you could say 3-to-1 Ukrainian advantage in terms of manpower at the front line. If we're looking at the rear, there may be more Russian soldiers that were not committed, but they're not fighting in the urban battles in Vovcha, for instance. And so that is playing a role, of course, in the Ukrainians succeeding to counterattack. And the Russian forces, even if they have not recently shown as much of an offensive footing in this region, we do know that they are trying to make these positions permanent over here in the hopes of protracting the fighting over here, for instance, to try to attrit Ukrainians. That could be a part of their thinking calculus. And so here you could see the Russians digging trenches 2.7 kilometers from Vovcha, just to the northeast. Also a part of their stated goal of trying to secure this sort of strip of land that would be able to push back the range of Ukrainian shelling, so they wouldn't be able to hit various Russian positions and logistical hubs that are deeper into Russia proper. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.